I don't usually drive at night. Something about the darkness unsettles me, the way it stretches out, swallowing the road, making familiar places unrecognizable. But that evening, I had no choice. A work emergency had me leaving far later than planned, and by the time I realized I was lost, the clock was nearing midnight. The road was narrow, winding, and completely unfamiliar. My GPS had given up miles ago, leaving me with only the occasional road sign as guidance. The trees pressed in from both sides, their gnarled branches forming a canopy that blocked out what little moonlight there was. My headlights struggled against the darkness, illuminating just enough to keep me moving forward. I kept telling myself I'd find a main road soon, but after yet another sharp turn, hope dwindled. That's when I saw it, an old house, set back from the road, its silhouette stark against the black sky. A single light burned in an upstairs window, faint and flickering. The house looked abandoned, the kind of place you'd expect to see in a ghost story, but the light suggested someone might be there. Someone who could help. I pulled over, my tires crunching on the gravel shoulder. Sitting there for a moment, I debated my next move. The smart thing would have been to keep driving, but desperation clouded my judgment. I grabbed my phone, still no signal, and stepped out into the chilly night. The air was heavy, carrying a faint, acrid smell I couldn't place. Gravel crunched under my boots as I approached the house. The porch sagged under its own weight, and the door stood slightly ajar. "Hello," I called out, my voice unnaturally loud in the stillness. Nothing. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but something compelled me to push the door open and step inside. The air inside was colder, thick with the scent of mildew and something metallic. The faint glow from upstairs drew my eyes immediately. It felt like an invitation I couldn't refuse. "Is anyone here?" I tried again, taking cautious steps deeper into the house. The floor creaked beneath me, and shadows stretched long across the walls. Dust coated every surface, and the furniture, what little there was, looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The staircase loomed to my left, each step warped and groaning underfoot. The light grew brighter as I ascended, casting long shadows that danced across the peeling wallpaper. By the time I reached the top, my heart was pounding in my chest. The door to the lit room was slightly ajar, just like the front door had been. I nudged it open. The room was nearly empty, save for a single chair in the center and an old oil lamp on a small table beside it. The light from the lamp flickered, casting strange patterns on the walls. On the chair sat a photograph. I picked it up, holding it under the lamp's light. It was a picture of me, standing outside the house, just moments ago. A wave of cold washed over me, and my breath caught in my throat. I turned the photograph over, hoping for some kind of explanation, but the back was blank. My pulse thundered in my ears as I scanned the room, half expecting someone to jump out from the shadows. But the room was empty. Then I heard it, footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming from the stairs. My heart leapt into my throat as I backed away from the door. The sound grew louder, closer, accompanied by a low, guttural rasp, a voice, though I couldn't make out the words. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response, only the steady rhythm of footsteps, now just outside the room. I panicked, dropping the photograph and darting to the far side of the room. There was no way out, no other door, no window large enough to escape through. The footsteps stopped just beyond the threshold, and for a moment, there was silence. Then the door creaked open wider. The figure that stood there was shrouded in shadow, its features obscured, but its presence was undeniable, oppressive. The air grew heavier, and the metallic smell intensified, almost making me gag. "You shouldn't be here," the voice rasped, low and guttural. My survival instincts kicked in. I lunged past the figure, my shoulder grazing something cold and solid as I bolted for the stairs. The house seemed to come alive around me, every creak and groan amplified as I stumbled down the steps. Behind me, The footsteps resumed, faster now, chasing me with relentless intent. I hit the front door at full speed, nearly tearing it off its hinges as I burst outside. The cold night air stung my lungs as I sprinted to my car. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking as the sound of footsteps grew louder. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I peeled out onto the road, gravel spraying in my wake. In the rearview mirror, the house was dark again, the light in the upstairs window extinguished. But on the porch stood the figure, watching me. Its shadow stretched impossibly long across the ground, as though it were reaching for me. I didn't stop driving until I reached the safety of my own driveway. Even then, I sat in the car for what felt like hours, too afraid to step outside. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I do know one thing: I'll never drive at night again. When I moved to that small rural town, I didn't expect much to happen. The kind of town where the streets are quiet and everyone knows everyone else's business. But that town, it had secrets. In the woods behind the house, that old, forgotten patch of land, was where I'd first start noticing them. It wasn't long before I found out about the well. At first, it seemed like nothing more than an old, overgrown landmark. The town had a long history, and people would mention it in passing as if it were just a part of the landscape. The well in the woods, they'd say, and I assumed it was nothing more than some abandoned relic. Just an old, decrepit stone well, hidden deep in the trees. I wasn't the type to go exploring in places like that. I kept to the small, neat streets of the town, where I knew I was safe. But that all changed one evening when I overheard a conversation at the local diner. A group of older men were sitting in the corner booth, their hushed voices thick with a kind of fear that caught my attention. They say the well is not just a well, one man muttered, his hands shaking as he held his coffee cup. It's a doorway. Some say it leads somewhere else. Another man, his voice almost a whisper, responded, not somewhere. Someone. The way he said it sent chills up my spine. Someone? I didn't understand. They continued talking, but I could barely make out the rest of the conversation. It was like they didn't want anyone to hear. But the mention of the well, it had caught my attention. Later that evening, I found myself standing at the edge of the woods, looking out at the tall, thick trees that stretched for miles. It was getting dark, the sky painted in deep blues and purples, and there was a chill in the air. I wasn't sure why, but I had this unshakable feeling that I needed to go see the well for myself. Maybe I was just curious, maybe it was the way they spoke of it, but whatever it was, I couldn't ignore the pull. The path to the well wasn't easy to find. The woods were dense, the trees towering above me as I pushed through the underbrush. But after about 20 minutes of walking, I saw it, a clearing, and in the middle, the well. At first, it looked like just any old well. Stones piled together in a round formation, the wooden lid over the top, a faint smell of damp earth in the air. I approached it cautiously, feeling the weight of something heavy pressing against my chest. I stood there, staring down into the darkness. The inside of the well seemed impossibly deep. I could hear nothing coming from it. No sound of water, no echo. Just a deep, unsettling silence. It felt like the kind of place you're not supposed to be. I almost wanted to turn around and leave. But then, I heard it. A faint noise, like a whisper, drifting up from the depths of the well. I froze, trying to convince myself it was the wind, or maybe just my imagination playing tricks on me. But no, there was something down there. Something calling. I couldn't make out the words, but the voice was unmistakable. It sounded like a child, soft and pleading. Help me, please. It was barely audible, but I heard it clear as day. My heart raced. I took a step back, then another. I almost turned to leave, but something kept me there. Maybe it was my curiosity. Maybe I was just too scared to go back the way I came. But I found myself moving closer, peering over the edge. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow. Nothing clear, just something moving at the very bottom of the well. Then, slowly, as my eyes adjusted, I saw a figure. It wasn't fully formed, just a shape, like a silhouette against the darkness. But it was moving, reaching up toward me, like it was trying to climb out. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced with questions, but none of them made sense. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Please, help." Without thinking, I backed away quickly, almost tripping over my own feet as I stumbled backward into the woods. My heart was pounding in my chest, my thoughts racing. What had I just seen? Was it real? The moment I left the clearing and stepped back into the darkness of the trees, the air seemed to grow even colder. I could hear the rustling of leaves, but there was something else, something following me, moving just behind me. I ran. I don't remember how long I ran or how I managed to find my way out of the woods, but I didn't stop. When I finally reached the edge of the forest and saw the safety of the town in the distance, I didn't look back. I was shaking, my legs weak beneath me, my breath ragged and quick. It wasn't until I got home and locked the door behind me that I realized how utterly terrified I was. The next morning, I tried to dismiss it. I told myself it was a trick of the mind, that I was just imagining things. But then I saw something that made me question everything. I found a newspaper clipping from years ago, buried in a drawer in my kitchen. It was about a young girl who went missing in the woods. She was last seen near the area where the well stood. The article didn't say much else, just that they never found her, and her case was closed as a cold one. I couldn't stop thinking about that voice, that whisper, the child asking for help. Was it her? Was it someone else? And why had she been there? Was she still down there, trapped in the darkness of that well? I've avoided the woods since then. I won't go near the well. I don't even look in that direction when I drive by. But every night, without fail, I hear something, a faint whisper, carried on the wind, right outside my window. Help me. I know now that some places, some things, don't let you go so easily. I've lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood for years now. It's the kind of place where the lawns are neatly mowed, everyone waves as they drive past, and there's a general sense of peace. But if you'd asked me a few months ago whether I thought anything strange could happen in such a place, I would have laughed it off. It all started with Thomas, my next-door neighbor. He was an older man, late 60s, maybe early 70s. Thomas had lived in the house beside mine for as long as I could remember. He wasn't exactly the type to throw block parties or mingle with the neighbors. He was a quiet one who kept to himself. He'd wave when I passed by, maybe exchange a few words if we happened to be out at the same time, but that was about it. No one really knew much about him beyond the fact that he lived alone. It was just normal. One summer night, I remember it clearly. It was a Friday, and I was up a little later than usual. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard it, a loud bang. It was the kind of sound that makes you freeze, like someone slamming a door, but even louder. I jerked awake and, for a moment, I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. The house was eerily silent, and I strained to listen. I glanced out the window toward Thomas's house. From what I could see, the lights were still on in his living room. There was no sign of anyone walking around outside, no sounds of footsteps. But there was something odd. Just before I decided to go back to sleep, I thought I saw a figure moving quickly toward the back of his yard. It was too dark to make out who it was, but I had a gut feeling that it was Thomas. Still, I shrugged it off, thinking he was probably just coming home from a late night errand. The next morning, I checked to see if everything was normal. I didn't notice anything unusual at first, but then I saw it. His car wasn't parked in the driveway. Now, Thomas wasn't exactly irregular on the road, but I'd seen his car around often enough to know it was missing. That wasn't entirely unusual. He had a habit of going on short trips, sometimes just disappearing for a day or two. But this time felt different. As the day went on, there was no sign of him. I didn't see him in the yard, didn't hear him puttering around in his garden. I didn't think much of it at first. He was probably just out on one of his usual trips, maybe visiting family or something. But by the third day, I started to get an uneasy feeling. The house was silent, too silent. No lights, no sound, not even the usual rustle of the wind chimes hanging from his porch. And when I glanced over, his front door was wide open. It was so unlike Thomas to leave his door like that. I found myself standing in my own driveway, staring at his house, wondering if I should check on him. But part of me didn't want to intrude. After all, it wasn't my place. By the fourth day, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know if something had happened to him. I walked over to his house, my footsteps heavy in my chest. The door was still ajar, and now the air felt thick, oppressive. I knocked, waited, but there was no answer. It wasn't like him to not respond, not even a little grunt or mumble from inside. I knocked again, this time a little louder, but again, nothing. I walked around to the backyard, thinking maybe he'd be in the garden or out back, doing something. But when I rounded the corner, I froze. There was no sign of anyone, no movement, no noise, just stillness. It felt wrong. I decided to go inside. The door was unlocked, which wasn't surprising. It's not like Thomas had anyone over often, so I didn't think twice. I stepped into the dimly lit hallway and called out for him. "Thomas? You home?" I wasn't sure what I expected, but the silence that followed was more unsettling than anything. I walked through the house, room by room, but there was no sign of him anywhere. It was as if the house had been abandoned for months. Everything was in its place, but there was this eerie emptiness to it. The light on in the kitchen, an old coffee mug sat on the counter. The coffee was cold now, but it had clearly been there not long ago, almost like someone had just walked away in the middle of drinking it. My nerves started to get the best of me, but I pressed on. There had to be an explanation. Maybe Thomas had been ill, and someone had come to take him to a hospital. But nothing made sense. I wandered through the house, the floor creaking beneath my feet as I tried to make sense of it all. Nothing felt right. That's when I noticed something strange. A door at the end of the hallway, which I'd never seen before. I was sure Thomas had never had a basement, and I knew there was nothing in the house that would require an extra room like that. But there it was. The door was cracked open, just a little. My heart rate picked up, my instincts telling me to stay away, but I couldn't. Something was pulling me toward it. I stepped closer, my hand hovering near the doorknob, but before I could open it, I heard it. A sound, faint at first. It was a rustling, almost like fabric brushing against itself. It didn't make sense. Was someone else in the house? The thought hit me like a ton of bricks. I stepped back, my mind racing. This wasn't normal. I turned and ran. I didn't stop to question it. I bolted back out of that house, feeling like I was being chased, even though I knew there was no one behind me. My mind was racing. What had I just heard? What had I seen? For the next few weeks, Thomas's house remained empty. His car never returned. I hadn't seen him, and every time I looked toward his house, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from the windows. But whenever I'd try to approach, there would be no one there. And then, one evening, I saw him, Thomas, standing outside in his yard, staring at me. But something was wrong. His expression was blank, his eyes wide and unblinking, his posture stiff. almost unnatural. It was like he wasn't fully there. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. I stepped toward him, and the moment my foot crossed onto his yard, he turned and walked into the house, the door swinging open as if it had a life of its own. I don't know what's happened to Thomas. I don't know if I ever will. But every now and then, I'll catch a glimpse of him, standing in the window, staring out at the street, unmoving. And I wonder if he's really there, or if something else has taken his place. All I know is I haven't been able to shake the feeling that whatever happened to Thomas, it's still watching. And it's still waiting.